Thanks very much to the committee for inviting me, and I'm really pleased to be here. In a nutshell, this is what I'm going to talk about. I've been doing research on proofreading recently, and I've tried to broaden out the implications of this research for the talk today to ask what kind of issues it raises for the EAP community at large. So you can see on the screen that I'm going to start by talking about the proofreading research, but after I've done that, I'm then going to connect it to a number of issues that relate to the EAP community, the ethics of EAP, training and development of EAP practitioners, and the relevance of research as well. I think all three of these are big issues that we engage with continually. And then the difficult bit at the end is how we can make things better. That's always the difficult bit, but I'll have a little go. And there should be time at the end to ask you what you think about that sort of stuff. So I just want to say that the proofreading I'm talking about is one particular type of proofreading. It's perhaps the most common type of proofreading that many of us are engaged with. The proofreading of student essays for assessment rather than, say, the proofreading of book manuscripts or articles for publication or anything like that. The proofreading that students at our universities may ask us to do before they submit their essays for marking. Just a slide about the ubiquity of proofreading, in the UK anyway. I've written there that there are proofreader adverts around campus. In my own university, about 50 yards from my office, someone has put an enormous hoarding on the side of the building, about 20 or 30 foot long, saying, do you need help with your English proofreading services, and a mobile number. That might ring true with other people. Most UK universities now do have a policy about proofreading that's publicly available on their websites. But the policies are often quite vague. They're quite short. They don't go into a great deal of detail. And the question to ask to start with is what is being done in the name of proofreading? When we have a look at the literature, there's very crudely two different schools of thought. There's the idea that proofreading is somehow unethical. On the other hand, there's the idea that proofreading offers a legitimate form of support. So just talking a little bit about the first strand. And by the way, I haven't said what I mean by proofreading yet. I'm coming to that. Because I could spend an hour talking about that, but let's not. I'll get there. Proofreading is unethical. So I've just put on the slide there that there are often stories in places like Times Higher Education, the Guardian Higher Education blog, places like that link proofreading and essay mills and plagiarism together in one uneasy strand. For example, Beatty's headline there in Times Higher Education, "Fluency can be yours for a fee." So the idea is that students are buying their way to academic literacy through proofreading. The second strand in the literature is much more positive about proofreading and sees it as a legitimate form of pedagogic support. And I'm just going to show you a couple of quotes from a Guardian blog about proofreading. This writer's just making the point that if you've got a high-stakes document, then it's only sensible to get someone to have a look at it before you submit it. After all, when many of us write for publication, we might ask our friends or colleagues to have a look at something before we submit, so that the reviewers don't, we hope, tear us to pieces. And then the next quote is from a proofreader herself. And you can see that in the quote, she contrasts what she does with what she calls the more invasive copy editing. And she says what she does when she works on second language speakers of English texts, she looks at their spelling, their grammar, their punctuation, their typos, layout and format, and that's it. That's what she says. And she says, if proofreading means that, then it's a legitimate form of support. What all of that I've shown you so far, I think, highlights, obviously, is there's a lack of consensus as to what proofreading is. Is it typos, grammar, syntax, or is it something more? Is it legitimate? Is it unethical? There seems to be a lack of consensus. There seems to be a lack of disagreement. Certainly from research that I've done in the past, there was evidence of this, that there was disagreements amongst proofreaders themselves, amongst lecturers and so on, about appropriate behaviour. So there's a need to find out more about proofreading. The literature suggests there are unethical proofreading practices around. I resisted the urge to do a big literature review today. I thought, no, let's not. But I've written about this. There's many accounts of proofreaders being asked to ghostwrite texts, or even, here are some notes I've got, can you turn it into an essay, this kind of thing. And there's also evidence to suggest that proofreaders may have different conceptualizations of what they could and should be doing. Why does this matter to universities? Well, obviously, it matters in terms of policymakers. It matters in terms of what we can expect from an assessed piece of work. And as I'll come on to later, it can matter to EAP practitioners, because in my experience, EAP practitioners are often approached to ask for proofreading by students, or perhaps in your institute, you offer proofreading, or you explicitly in your writing centre say you don't do proofreading. In my own university, we've got what we call a writing advisory service, which is a one-to-one writing centre tutorial, and it explicitly says on the website that they don't do proofreading. So there are issues here about what we should or shouldn't be doing. So let me talk to you about some research that I've been doing recently. And so the first thing I want to talk about is how did I define proofreading? And the definition I gave was from some previous work, third-party interventions entailing written alteration on assessed work in progress. Now, that might not be your idea of proofreading. You might have a much narrower idea of what proofreading means, as in the quote at the bottom of the screen by the Society for Editors and Proofreaders, a process of identifying typos, linguistic, positional errors or omissions. The reason I didn't the reason I didn't limit myself in my research to that narrower definition is because I knew from previous research I'd done that some proofreaders don't limit themselves to that at all. Therefore, I wanted a very broad definition to see exactly what proofreaders did. So these were the methods that I used in my research. I started by giving a questionnaire to the proofreaders that were involved in my research. I then gave them a proofreading task to do. While they were proofreading, they talked aloud about what they were thinking, what they were doing, perhaps justifying what they were doing. And then there was an interview afterwards to find out more about how they'd proofread and what they'd been talking about in the talk aloud. So I'll just say a bit more about each of these instruments. So the questionnaire asked things like what their job was now or previously. It asked about their qualifications and training. Only one of the proofreaders, by the way, had any kind of proofreading, formal proofreading qualification. which didn't strike me as surprising at all. How many years they'd been proofreading and what kind of text they read, how low would they go, how poor would the English have to be before they declined. So the task that they did, I wanted to find out what proofreaders did, and I wanted to compare and contrast proofreaders' practices. Therefore, it was important for me to give them all the same text to proofread, so that I could fairly compare and contrast what people did. As you can see on the screen, they were given a completely authentic master's essay that had been written by a Chinese student and had been awarded a mark of 50, a bare pass. So, as you can imagine, with such a low mark, it was a very poor piece of work in terms of language and content. I've gone into a bit of detail there about the kind of language problems there were. Later on, I'm going to show you a sentence from the essay to give you a flavour of it. Lastly, the instructions to the proofreaders, I asked them to do whatever you normally do when you proofread. Now, the university I did this research in does have guidelines about what proofreaders are supposed to do. But I didn't want to give them those guidelines because I wanted them to do what they normally do. I knew from previous research that many proofreaders, in fact, had no knowledge of the university's proofreading guidelines. And so they didn't adhere to it. I wanted to find out what they really did without influencing them by saying to them, oh, and by the way, the university's brief is that you only do this. What did they do naturally? As they were proofreading, they talked out loud about what they were thinking and doing. I was in the room while they were doing this and made notes about what they were saying that would then form the basis for some of my interview questions. And then these were the kind of things that I asked about in the proofreading interview. Things like why they'd said the things they'd said, why they'd done some of the things they'd done, why sometimes the proofreaders expressed uncertainty or irritation. I asked them more about that. So I was getting more detail about what they were saying while they were talking aloud. So who were the proofreaders? I got 14 proofreaders, as I say, all working within the same UK university, and very crudely, they divided into 3 different profiles. What I call the professionals proofread as their main job or as a good part of their main job. The freelancers were mainly PhD students who were proofreading for a bit of extra cash to help fund their studies. And then finally, there were volunteers who proofread free of charge normally for friends. Just a flavour of the kind of people that took part. So 3 of the 14 here. You'll see that Bernard was classified as a professional. He actually works at an English language EAP centre, and proofreading was an official part of his job. He did face-to-face tutorials with students, and that was, as I say, that was sanctioned, officially, institutionally sanctioned. One of the freelancers, Fiona, she was a retired lecturer who said she was proofreading to make a bit of pocket money, and then proceeded to tell me all the tax she paid on the money, so it wasn't worth doing. And then Sally was a volunteer, all pseudonyms obviously. She was a PhD student who proofread for her friends in the department. So let me show you some quantitative data to begin with, a very simple statistic. When I looked at how many interventions proofreaders made on the writing, they made between 113 and 472 interventions. You can see from that number that there's evidence of very marked variation from proofreader to proofreader, and I'm going to show you more on that in a moment. I'm just going to look at one sentence from the essay, and this will also give you a flavour of the quality of the writing as well. Here it is, and it's unredacted. There are obviously a number of problems with this sentence. Beginning with the language problems, there are problems with number use. So you've got the singular assignment, second line from bottom, when it should be plural. There are problems with article use in China examination. There are problems with tenses and verb formation. Another problem is the message is obscure. In fact, this comes from near the end of the essay, and the writer begins to talk about a precessional. She hasn't mentioned a precessional at all in the 2,000 words that precede this. And this is very much, it seems like an afterthought, and it's obscure what she means and what precessional she's talking about and what her role is here. And then there's bits in the sentence that require more explanation or contextualization. For example, she says, China examination. Well, what China examination is that? What does that mean? And what has that got to do with anything? And what does spot dictation mean? And so on. So, we could pull that apart and spend a lot of time pulling it apart. The reason I've picked this sentence is simply because you can see that if you were a proofreader and you decided to intervene, you could obviously start fixing the language, but you could also stray into argumentation and content as well, if you thought that was appropriate. So let's have a look at what some of the proofreaders did to this piece of writing. Very crudely, I've split them into 3 groups. There were proofreaders who made a larger number of changes, smaller number of changes, and then there were proofreaders who intervened at the level of content as well. So, beginning with the larger number of changes, I've just written the student's sentence on the left, and I've written the proofreader's version on the right. Here we see Jackie, the proofreader, makes various changes. She changes awkward phrasings. For example, became a novel aspect becomes it became clear. Has become becomes now constitute. China examination, examinations held in China. She corrects a faulty preposition on academic writing. She makes additions to clarify the writer's message, questions. She replaces a comma with a semicolon near the end of what's a lengthy sentence, before however. And the multiple interventions she makes are typical of her proofreading all the way through. Why did she do it? Well, you can see what her objectives were from the interview quote at the top of the screen. She wants something that's as error-free as possible. And I've just given you another example that wasn't from the sentence that I showed you. In another place, at the beginning of the essay, the writer had said, so-and-so's point of view is more and more controversial. Now, grammatically, there was actually nothing wrong with what the writer had written. It was short, it was inelegant, it wasn't very good stylistically, but it wasn't incorrect. Jackie changed that to increasingly controversial. And I asked her about that in the interview, and she said, well, that sounds better in an academic essay. So you can see that Jackie wasn't just thinking about trying to make an essay comprehensible, she was also trying to make it stylistically, enhance things stylistically as well. In contrast, there were proofreaders who made fewer changes. For example, Helena. And you'll see here, Helena doesn't make any changes whatsoever. She underlines the sentence, that's all. Why did she do it? Well, very interesting. In her interview, she repeatedly told me that she didn't think it was her job to make things easy for the writer. She said, "My role is not to make the text flawless or grammatically perfect." She said, "As long as the writer gets the message across, that's enough." And why? Because it's all about ethics for her. So you can see here, she says, "If I only correct more minimally, I can live with myself if I do that." And you're giving the writer the message, you have to try more yourself, you have to try more yourself. Here's what's wrong with it, you fix it. Instead of telling me to fix it, you fix it, not me, you fix it. She railed about international students, and by the way, she was a second language speaker of English herself, but she railed against international students who were admitted with an English language proficiency to university that was too low, in her opinion, and worse, who weren't willing to work on it themselves and improve their proficiency themselves, that wanted the proofreader to just fix it. Finally, there were other kinds of proofreaders who made changes beyond language in terms of content, argumentation, ideas, one of whom was Anna. And you can see Anna's comment here in red at the bottom. So on this sentence, Anna writes to the writer, "You could add a description of the teaching context you're referring to." So the significance of this intervention is that it's not about language at all. It's about how good the writer's argument is, how much information the writer decides to supply, and it's about content. Just to show you this isn't unusual, and it isn't unusual at all from Anna's proofreading, I'm going to show you now 3 more comments that Anna wrote on this essay. So the writer is reviewing literature, and Anna tells her that she needs to improve her review of this study. Define what the article you're reviewing was about. Add certain information about the experimental group and the control group. What was the procedure? What was the result of the experiment? Support your view with more arguments. You just describe what the researchers did, but blah, blah, blah. So this is all about content. And you might look at that and think, well, it ain't proofreading, whatever it is. Why did she do this? That's what she says. Anna belonged to the same discipline as the writer, TESOL, Applied Linguistics, and she said, I can help put the student's mind or their thoughts into order. I can help them with the language, I can help them with the content. Anna had no problem with helping on both levels. I'm just going to give you a few more examples of how other proofreaders proofread at the level of content, because it wasn't only Anna, several did so. So, for example, Linda changed the structure of a text. Moira explained to me how when the writer submitted a piece of work to her for proofreading, Moira asked the writer for the texts, the readings the writer had used. And I said, well, why'd you do that? And she said, so that I can go through the sources that they've used to make sure that they've summarized the sources accurately. And also to make sure they've avoided plagiarism. Sheila and Anna were other examples of proofreaders who tried to enhance the writer's arguments as well. So where the writer had made an argument they thought was quite weak, they would write a comment saying, this isn't a very good argument, you could make it better, and sometimes suggesting how the writer could make it better. In a nutshell then, I hope I've demonstrated there was a real variation in proofreading practices, and the study demonstrates that conceptualizations of what a proofreader is, what a proofreader should do, vary a lot. Just talking about a couple of proofreading roles. There are various ways of conceptualizing proofreading, and one way of doing it is using metaphors. And there are a couple of metaphors here to describe proofreading roles. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the cleaner. So this is the idea where the proofreader fixes or cleans up the text, mostly by eliminating surface level errors. And I've just given you an example here of a proofreader doing that. So correcting number errors, putting an and in, moving compared, correcting latter and later, and so on. Then there's the idea of the proofreader as teacher. So the idea here is that the proofreader follows Stephen North's proposal of writing centre pedagogy. If you've read North's article, if you haven't, I recommend it. It might be old, but it's still very good and thought-provoking. So Stephen North says the idea of the writing centre is not to improve the text alone, it's also to improve the writer. In other words, writing centres are supposed to benefit writers pedagogically. It's not just about fixing up a text, it's about making the person a more skillful, more knowledgeable writer. So you can see a quote on the screen here from Bernard. He's talking about when he does a proofreading tutorial and what he does if he sees a repetitive error. He says, I actually will stop and I'll teach the student about this error. So if they keep making the same error, he'll teach it. Because he says, I want to see them get better. Another thing that came out of the data was a real sense of disquiet or self-doubt on the part of some proofreaders about what they were doing. I'll give you an example. Fiona, during her talk aloud, said, I wonder whether I'm going beyond my remit here, as she was proofreading the text. I'll just show you the kind of passage she was talking about and what she did. So you can see that there's quite a rewrite here. She's deleted quite a few words, and she actually asks the writer to check what she's done. I asked her about this going beyond my remit comment in her talk aloud during the interview afterwards. And this is what she said. It's quite interesting that Fiona contrasts the traditional idea of the proofreader, perhaps associated with the publishing world, that puts in a semicolon or adds a comma or something like that, a slip, and contrasts that with what she's doing. And she says, sometimes I'm rewriting the whole thing. And that's why the ethical dilemma comes in. Let me tell you a little bit more about Fiona. She's a retired lecturer, and she'd been lecturing for many years. And she talked about the university's admission policies, and she claimed, and remember, this is a very experienced lecturer, this isn't some person who's never been a lecturer themselves. She claimed that the doctoral students she was proofreading for, she claims that she would fail their writing at undergraduate level. If she was still lecturing, and they wrote their writing for her undergraduate class, she says she would fail it. However, she says, by proofreading, I'm part of the system, I'm condoning this. So in her view, the university shouldn't be admitting these students, but they are, and she's helping to smooth out the system. Obviously, in what I've shown you, there's a very ethical, there's a strong ethics theme coming out here. And of course, we can link this to EAP very easily. We can link this to the role of the EAP practitioner. We can think about the ethics of EAP and what we're doing and whether we should be doing what we're doing. I've put a few questions here. I don't know whether, as B said, this might make you uncomfortable or not, but we'll see. Just a few questions that occur to me. If we're involved in an English language teaching centre or a writing centre, what should our policy be towards proofreading? Should we be doing it? Should we not be doing it? If we do decide to do it, what form should it take? Should we just be a cleaner or a fixer-upper? Or should we be trying to improve the writers as well as the writing? What do we do about low proficiency students entering university? Do we condone it? Do we resist it? This is surely a form of critical EAP. One of the things that I would argue is that proofreading can be done in a much more ethical manner if it's regulated much more strongly than it is now. As I said earlier, most UK universities will have guidelines on proofreading available on their websites, but the information is often vague, and students are permitted to approach anyone to proofread their essays. I found in my research as well, I haven't talked about this today, but I found the competence of proofreaders varied as well. Some of my proofreaders made what was already a dreadful piece of writing even worse. No, I'm not, it's not, I know, okay, it's funny, but it's no laughing matter, is it? Some of the proofreaders introduced errors into the text and made what was already dreadful even worse. And some didn't. So there was a profound variation in terms of competence. And as I say, the universities I'm familiar with in the UK, they allow students to approach anyone who says they act as a proofreader. The problem is, as well, as I found from my research, that students will often approach family or friends for proofreading. That's often the most common proofreader they ask. And family or friends, even if universities have a proofreading policy, the family or friends are either ignorant of the policy, they don't know the policy exists, or even if they did know it existed, they can ignore it at will. So I think the way things are at the moment, I do think this is an uncomfortable issue. And I think some people in universities would rather we didn't raise this issue at all. That's where we are at the moment in the UK, and I don't like it. How can we improve things? Well, here are some ideas. If we decided to keep proofreading in-house in our own EAP centres, I think it would allow us better to do all of those things. We could regulate better, we could surveil better. I know surveil is normally a very sinister word, but I think in this case, I hope you see where I'm coming from. I'm saying it's a good thing here. We could have standardization and training sessions. We could work up better guidelines than our universities give us. We could better ensure consistency from one proofreader to another, and perhaps even more importantly, we could make proofreading a formative experience. Some colleagues in Italy that I did a talk with many years ago, what they used to do was proofread a part of the text and get the students to do the rest of it themselves. And there was a real pedagogic emphasis, rather than a fix it, accept all changes, there you are, there's your essay kind of attitude. Don't misunderstand me, I'm not trying to say that freelance proofreaders who work outside of our EAP centres are necessarily bad. I'm not saying that at all. The organisation I mentioned earlier, the Society for Proofreaders and Editors, or Editors and Proofreaders, it's an excellent organisation, it really is. I've got an awful lot of time for them. And the people that belong to that organisation, I would be very confident would do a very good job and stay within the boundaries they were given and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, many of the so-called proofreaders that are out there wouldn't. This leads me on to another uncomfortable question. In my study, I found that some proofreaders were knowledgeable and some were much less so. Some were competent or largely competent, and others much less so. What about EAP practitioners? Are they all around the world? Are they ready, able, willing, equipped to perform their duties, to do what they should be doing? I want to talk a little bit about that. First of all, let me start by the non-controversial stuff. On the slide, I just mentioned how difficult being an EAP practitioner is. We all know that. That's why we're here. We know that in the literature, Dudley, Evans and St. John, they talk about the various duties, the roles of EAP practitioners: designing courses, evaluating students, writing materials, collaborating with content faculty, doing research, and so on. And we can also add another function, maybe, the proofreader as well. So they have all of these jobs, and it's very difficult to do. And then I just mentioned briefly the EGAP and ESAP debate, English for general or specific academic purposes. It sometimes seems to me that the more we learn about the peculiarities and the idiosyncrasies and the variation within the academy in terms of how we speak and how we write and the genres we produce, the more complicated our job seems to be. If we want to get specific, if we want to try and help a chemistry student write a lab report and a historian write some other kind of genre, it gets very messy and complicated. So the more we find out, the more formidable the job appears. So the question is, with all of this to do EAP practitioners around the world get the support they need? No. The first quote is from a master's student of mine from last year who was Kuwaiti, who wrote her dissertation about EAP in Kuwait. And I like the way she's written it here. This is her summing up her findings. And you can see how she talks about how in her institution, in the institutions she investigated, the practitioners were flung into an EAP context with little time, support, or training to prepare them. They had to fend for themselves. Doug Bell's PhD, a very interesting read indeed. He's not talking about Kuwait this time, he's talking about EAP generally, and you can see, he says a lot of EAP teachers start in ELT, General English Teaching, and then they transition across, and again, they're given very little help, training, professional development. I've cited a couple of other studies at the bottom of the slide. There's a study from China that says the same thing. There's a study that I did with one of my Saudi students, the same thing. In the Saudi case, it was literally overnight that they were asked to stop being EFL teachers and become EAP teachers or ESP teachers with no training, support, help at all. There's also, of course, the fact that many EAP practitioners around the world may be isolated. There's a quote here from China, and low status as well. And the EAP practitioner in this study talks about how even within his own department, he's in a department with linguists, literature scholars and translation scholars. Even within his own department, they feel cut off. The other staff members don't talk to them. They're seen as low status. They're seen as doing something that isn't worth researching. Alex and Ian, of course, their book, I'll come on to that in a minute, in their book they talk about this at length, and Greg Hadley's book as well talks about the low status of EAP practitioners in many parts of the world. So obviously new EAP practitioners can find things daunting. They need to learn subject knowledge. They need to be able to write EAP materials. There might not be a textbook that's suitable. And they have to make this transition. And it can be really tricky. And their problems are exacerbated for the following reasons, and I guess you can think of many more as well. They have heavy workloads, they have a lack of institutional support, there's limited professional development. In some cases, they might be asked to publish. In others, as we're going to see in a moment, they're not encouraged to publish at all. They're just given loads of teaching. So this is a problem. Is everything rosy in the garden? It might be for most of us, I don't know, but it certainly isn't for everyone. Come to the last thing I want to talk about now, which is about EAP research. There's been a proliferation in EAP and ESP research over the last 30 or 40 years. It's quite incredible. It's a real growth industry. There's some places around the world, like Hong Kong, for example, where there's so much research being done, and it's very heartening in some respects. And you would think that if we say that EAP practitioners are unsupported, you would think they would be able to find a valuable source of support in the literature with all this work that's going on. After all, as Hyland and Shaw say in the quote, EAP these days is a much more theoretically informed enterprise. The research base is much stronger than it used to be. I certainly firmly believe that. When you look back at the journal I edit, I shouldn't be saying this publicly, I'm going to get into trouble. If I look back 30, 40 years to the research that the journal I edit used to publish, and you look at the research now, I think it's much more sophisticated. EAP research is really growing and proliferating. However, in the same way that I found a real disconnect between what the Society for Editors and Proofreaders said proofreaders should do and what most of my proofreaders did do, in the same way there seems to be a disconnect between the EAP practitioner community and the EAP research community. Ding and Bruce in their book talk about a schism between research and practitioners' concerns. This is clearly very worrying. For example, a study there on the slide from Iran found that the EAP practitioners in their research felt EAP research lacked relevance to them, it lacked applicability to them, it lacked practicality to them. Mary Davis has just published an article, it's in press but it's online in Jeep, about this, which is really interesting. Mary talks about the lack of practitioner research found in journals like my journal, ESPJ, and Jeep as well. And she also talks about the problems that practitioners experience when they try and publish. Why do they experience these problems? These are some of the factors she talks about. The first couple are predictable. We're all overworked, we know that. We're all underpaid as well. But the second two, well, the third one anyway, is a bit, is something else. I'm going to show you two quotes from her interviewees. So in the first quote, the director of the centre says, we're not getting anything out of that, you're not going to have any time for research. In the second one, the interviewee said that her head of department positively made life difficult for her to do any research. This is really dispiriting and discouraging because, as we all know, theory and practice in EAP are absolutely inextricably linked, or they certainly should be. And more than that, EAP practitioners, as Alex, Ian, and Mary, and many other people have said, EAP practitioners have a very valuable role to play in enhancing EAP research and driving the discipline forward. I'm just going to show you a couple of quotes from something I wrote about this. Who better to do research than practitioners that are in contact with content lecturers, that are in touch with students, constantly. Who better than EAP practitioners to say, this research that's being published is not what I need. It might be valuable in some ways, but there's no research going on about this topic. We need research on that, and to do it. Steve Kirk, later in the conference, is going to talk about local pedagogy and localized research. I think that's right. EAP teachers can try and solve problems on the ground that aren't talked about in journals, in international journals. In a nutshell then, you know the answer that I'm going to give you. Is everything rosy in the EAP garden? No, it's not. It's not. Perhaps there's a sense that all of us here in this room are in a very privileged position. But if we think about the EAP community as a whole, as I say, that I've been very struck when I've done research with my students from other parts of the world, struck at the absolute lack of communication, support, training, development, awareness of all the issues connected with EAP and what EAP practitioners should be doing. So, now for the tricky bit to finish with. How do we make things better? Here are some ideas. At the end, perhaps many of you will have much better ideas than I have. Let me talk about each of these briefly. I'm drawing on other people. I'm drawing on Doug Bell. I'm drawing on Gemma Campion. They both talk about training. They talk about how we should have more qualifications specifically focused on EAP. Not just the Delta, not the CELTA, not the PGCE, whatever qualifications. Not general English, but actually EAP qualifications. They talk about the importance of less formal kinds of training. Doug Bell talks about the value of critical reflection. Campion talks about classroom observations of more experienced EAP practitioners. There's also, of course, trying to understand our subject departments much more by observing them, talking to lecturers, that kind of stuff. Of course, we need our institutions to back us. We need recognition from our institutions. We need support and resourcing. We need in-service development as well as pre-service development. For research, I happen to think that in my journal we publish really good EAP research. I would say that, of course, but we need more local and localized research that speaks to practitioners' needs as well. Doug Bell talks about grappling with low status in EAP, and he says one of the ways we may be able to raise our status is to do a lot more work with subject departments and raise our research status in that way, which I think is a good idea. A lot more events and EAP meetings to disseminate research, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and, dare I say it, more funding from BALEAP to do research. There's just been a scheme launched, I think, for collaborative projects, which is great, fabulous. I wish the net was a bit wider, though, and I wish there was a bit more money available as well. I don't hold the purse strings, and I don't know what BALEAP finances are like, but the idea of making money available is certainly most welcome. Let me get on my high horse a bit here. One of the things that I've seen over 20 years of being involved in higher education and teaching and research, when I started going to conferences, the conference fee was 50 quid. And BERA for non-members is now charging £500 for their conference fee. I've got to tell you, I think it's outrageous. I think it's disgraceful. This is not the way to disseminate research. This is not the way to get unsupported, unfunded EAP teachers in to learn about this stuff. I absolutely applaud BALEAP for introducing free ResTes conferences. I think it's exemplary. And whoever thought of that and pushed it through, they deserve, in my opinion, a pat on the back. I think it's great. What I would like BALEAP now to do is get more international and found networks in other countries, in other places, and do similar things there themselves. Let's have a Saudi Arabia ResTes for BALEAP. Let's have ResTes in many other countries. Let's have chapters of BALEAP all over the world and really grow the research and the knowledge base of EAP. Finally, we need to do this tricky thing of influencing policymakers. I talked about proofreading and I said I found many disturbing things. What I need to try and do is work with my university to get their proofreading practices and policies changed. Actually, I have tried, and it got nowhere. I was invited to sit on a proofreading working group. We wrote a big report, and guess what? It was kicked into touch. But we need to try and influence the people that make these decisions. I've just mentioned there, for example, university regulations for admissions. What kind of students do we want? What do we need to help them? And so on. We need to try and influence the people who set these, in some cases, quite arbitrary criteria. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.